Not a lot of people want to talk about it because when you talk about it, you put a target on your back. And I think one of the first things I want to ask you is, how does someone stand up and do the right thing when they know that they're going to face great opposition when they do it?
The envelope looked harmless, just a letter from Rebecca and JW. But the moment its contents leaked, Daystar was thrown into chaos. Names were exposed, secrets dragged into the light, and everything people thought they knew about Joni Lamb suddenly felt like a lie. Supporters are stunned, critics are celebrating, and the entire ministry is shaking like it's seconds from collapse. This wasn't just a letter, it was a bomb waiting to go off. It started like so many shocking moments do, quiet, almost unnoticed. A letter, just a few pages written by someone close to the Lamb family. But this wasn't just any letter. It came from Jonathan Weiss, the husband of Rebecca Lamb, Joni's own daughter. And what it said changed everything. For months, Joni had stood confidently in front of cameras, telling the world that the accusations against Pete were false, exaggerated, or rooted in bitterness. She insisted that only two people, her son Jonathan and his wife Susie, were making noise. Everyone else in the family, she claimed, stood united. No evidence, no real concern, just a broken relationship and hurt feelings. But then came that letter. Jonathan Weiss wasn't an outsider or a distant relative. He was family. He had been right there in the room. He had seen things himself. And in this letter, he laid it all out. How he and Rebecca had witnessed behavior from Pete that made them deeply uncomfortable. Things that didn't seem right. Moments that crossed a line no adult should ignore. The letter wasn't vague. It described specific actions and interactions involving their young niece. And it didn't come from a place of gossip. It came from first-hand experience. JW had seen enough to put it in writing. He didn't just talk about it privately. He sent it to the Daystar board. That was a big move. It meant he wanted it taken seriously. And here's where everything starts to fall apart. If Joni had been telling the truth, if it really was just Jonathan and Susie who had concerns, then why did her son-in-law feel the need to write this? Why did he put so much on the line to share what he'd seen? Suddenly, the story that had been presented to the public didn't hold up. The image of a united family, of two outliers stirring up drama, cracked wide open. JW's letter proved that concern ran deeper than anyone had admitted. It wasn't just two voices crying out. There were more. There had always been more. But the worst part? The letter was never handed to police. For reasons no one fully understands, it stayed hidden, locked away, silent. And because of that, what could have been critical evidence never became part of the official investigation. But even in the shadows, the letter's existence changed everything. It proved that the truth had been closer than people thought, just buried, waiting to be heard. It all looked so perfect, at least on the outside. The Lamb family, standing tall together, smiling through broadcasts, sharing scripture, praying as one. To millions watching Daystar over the years, they were the picture of unity. A Christian family leading a powerful ministry with grace and purpose. They stood in front of the world as a strong, God-fearing team, with Joni at the helm after Marcus passed away. But behind that picture, something very different was going on. Something fragile, something already cracking. At first, when the allegations against Pete surfaced, Joni moved quickly. She took control of the message. In interviews and public statements, she made it clear. There was no evidence, no real issue, just Jonathan and Susie, her son and daughter-in-law, stirring things up. She painted them as emotional, dramatic, even divisive. The story being told to the world was simple. The family was united except for these two, and people believed it. Because why wouldn't they? The rest of the family was silent. Nobody else came forward, so Joni's story stood, but it wasn't true. The unity she spoke about was an illusion, and like all illusions, it only held up as long as no one looked too closely. What many didn't know was that Joni's daughter Rebecca and her husband Jonathan Weiss, known as JW, weren't quietly nodding along behind the scenes. They had serious concerns about Pete, concerns about how the situation was being handled, concerns that started long before the public knew anything was wrong. In fact, JW had written a letter, a real letter, not some whisper, not a rumor. It was a documented account of what he had personally witnessed. He had seen behavior from Pete that disturbed him deeply, and he didn't keep it to himself. He gave it to Daystar's board. That letter shattered everything Joni had said, because it proved something critical. Jonathan and Susie weren't alone. For a moment, it looked like the illusion might finally fall. With JW's testimony and Rebecca's support, the image of a divided couple could no longer explain away the accusations. There were more people inside the Lamb family who saw the same things, more people willing to say something wasn't right. But then something changed. Rebecca and JW went quiet. They didn't give the letter to the police. They didn't follow through with their early support. Instead, they stepped back. Whether it was pressure, fear, loyalty, or something else, we don't know. But their silence helped Joni rebuild the illusion. The story that only two people had a problem with Pete became believable again. And with no one else contradicting it, Joni stood behind the pulpit, behind the cameras, and kept telling the world that her family was standing strong. But inside the family, that unity was gone. Jonathan and Susie were isolated. They'd lost their jobs at the ministry, been cut off from friends, had their motives questioned over and over again. They weren't just dealing with the pain of what they believed had happened to their daughter, they were carrying the burden of being seen as the enemies of the family. They were alone, while others stayed quiet. And that silence hurt even more than the public attacks, because it came from people who had once promised to stand beside them. You see, what looked like a united front was really a house built on pressure. Behind the scenes, there were conversations no one wanted to have. People were uncomfortable. Some didn't know what to believe. Others were too afraid to say what they really felt. And Joni, determined to protect the ministry's image, kept pushing the narrative forward. Confident, unwavering, untouchable. But cracks always find the light. As more information came out, the illusion started to weaken. People began to ask questions about the letter, about why the rest of the family never spoke, about why the story kept changing. And slowly, piece by piece, the image of perfect harmony broke apart. The most painful part? The illusion had worked. For a while, it worked on viewers, on supporters, on pastors who had once trusted the Lamb family with their own platforms. It worked on people who had given their hearts and their money to the ministry. They believed Joni when she said her family stood together. They believed her when she said it was just a misunderstanding. And then they learned that it wasn't true, that other family members had concerns, that the letter existed, that the investigation was paused, not ended, and that silence wasn't proof of peace. It was just silence. And once that truth started to slip through the cracks, it became impossible to keep pretending. What had once looked like a wall of strength was really just a fragile illusion, held together by silence, fear, and the desire to protect something that no longer deserved protection. Unity, real unity, is built on truth, not pressure, not performance, and not fear. What happened behind the scenes of Daystar wasn't unity. It was a performance, one that required people to stay quiet, to go along, to smile in public while holding their pain in private. That's not what families are supposed to be. That's not what faith is supposed to look like. And for many who once believed in the ministry with all their hearts, realizing that truth was the most devastating blow of all. Because once the illusion of unity fell apart, it left behind something far more troubling. The question of how far people are willing to go to protect a lie, and what happens when they finally stop pretending. It all started with a pause, just a pause. Not a verdict, not a statement of innocence or guilt. But that pause, quiet, vague, and full of unanswered questions, was quickly turned into something much bigger. Something that looked a lot like truth, but wasn't. The moment the investigation into Pete was temporarily halted, Daystar leadership acted fast. Joni Lamb stood firm, telling the world that everything was fine, that Pete had cooperated, that there was no evidence, that the whole thing had come to nothing. For viewers who had followed the ministry for years, it sounded like closure, case closed, accusations unfounded, the family, the ministry, the mission, safe. But that wasn't the real story. The investigation wasn't paused because Pete was cleared. It wasn't paused because the police changed their minds. It was paused because the child at the center of it all, young, scared, and emotionally shaken, couldn't talk about what had happened. The detective involved said it plainly. The child needed time. Forcing a conversation at that point could do more harm than good. That's why things were paused, not ended. The door was left wide open for the investigation to continue when the child was ready. But you wouldn't know that from the way Daystar told it. Their version was different, cleaner, simpler. In their hands, a temporary pause became a full stop. A lack of movement became a declaration of innocence. They didn't mention the child's condition. They didn't mention that the investigation could reopen at any time. Instead, they pushed out a message of victory. Pete's been cleared. The truth has won. This was all just a misunderstanding. They used the pause like a shield, and for a while, it worked. Supporters breathed a sigh of relief. Pastors who had stood with the ministry felt justified. Viewers who had been uneasy suddenly felt like they could trust again. After all, if the police weren't moving forward, there must be nothing to investigate, right? That's what Daystar wanted them to believe. Behind the scenes, though, more was going on. There was a letter, written by Joni's son-in-law, JW, that told a different story. A letter that described what he and his wife, Rebecca, had seen with their own eyes. Behavior from Pete that crossed the line. And it wasn't just vague impressions. It was detailed, specific, firsthand. But the public never heard about that letter because it was never given to the police. Instead, it stayed in the shadows, quietly supporting the very thing Daystar was denying, that there was real reason for concern, that the accusations weren't just a family feud, that others had seen the same disturbing behavior that Jonathan and Susie, Joni's son and daughter-in-law, had tried to expose. But without that letter, and without public support from Rebecca and JW, Joni's version of the story stood strong. And when people asked why there wasn't an investigation anymore, Daystar had their answer ready. There was no evidence. Pete's name is clear. God has stepped in. They didn't just twist the truth, they dressed it in faith. They used religious language to sell the story. Some statements even suggested divine protection had surrounded Pete, shielding him from lies and slander. It was powerful messaging. Not just the law has spoken, but God has spoken. Not just trust us, but trust God's work through us. And in the world of Christian broadcasting, where faith and loyalty run deep, that kind of message hits hard. It doesn't just quiet critics, it silences them. Who wants to argue with what sounds like God's will? But here's the problem. They weren't telling the whole story. They left out the pain of a child. They ignored the concerns from inside their own family. They spun a narrative around a legal technicality and turned it into gospel truth. They said there was no proof, but they knew proof existed. They just made sure it never saw daylight. It wasn't just about protecting Pete. It was about protecting the brand. Daystar is more than a ministry. It's a business, a platform, a public image. And in that world, scandal is dangerous. Truth, when it's messy and uncomfortable, threatens the structure. So they reshaped it. They smoothed it out. They silenced those who spoke up and elevated those who stayed quiet. For Jonathan and Susie, the ones who refused to be quiet, the price was high. They lost jobs, friends, their place in the ministry. They were painted as troublemakers, as bitter, as unstable. But they never backed down because they knew the truth. And they knew the truth wasn't being told. And the longer the pause lasted, the more Daystar leaned into their version. Every month the case didn't reopen was held up as more proof that nothing ever happened. Every moment of silence from the police was used to say, "See, we told you, they lied." But silence isn't proof. A paused case is not a closed one. A hurting child isn't a cleared name. And a well-written press release doesn't make a lie true. Over time, pieces of the real story began to slip through. Whispers about the child's emotional state. Questions about the missing letter. People started asking harder questions. The perfect image cracked. And some supporters, those who had trusted the Lamb family with their prayers, donations, and faith, began to feel betrayed because they realized what had happened. They hadn't just been misled. They had been manipulated, and not by strangers, but by the very people they looked to for spiritual guidance. Leaders who should have told the truth, even when it was hard, even when it risked everything. Instead, they hid behind a pause. They turned it into a wall to protect themselves. And they used their influence, their platform, and their faith to make sure no one looked too closely. But once you see behind the curtain, it's hard to unsee it. Once you realize that the truth was managed, not shared, it changes everything. And that's the cost of manipulation. It doesn't just break trust in one story. It breaks trust in the whole system, in the leadership, in the message, in the ministry itself. Because if they could twist this, what else did they twist? In the end, the pause wasn't proof. It was a strategy, one built on silence, on fear, and on the hope that no one would ask too many questions. But the truth always finds a way out. And when it does, the people who believe the lie are the ones left picking up the pieces, wondering how they missed it, wondering if they can ever trust again, wondering if the people they followed in faith were ever honest at all. That's what happens when leaders choose image over integrity. The damage lasts far longer than the story itself. It didn't happen all at once. At first there were voices, quiet ones, but present. People who had seen things, heard things, felt that knot in their stomach that said, something's not right. There were family members, friends, and insiders who whispered support behind closed doors. If this goes to court, we've got your back, they said. You're not alone in this. But one by one, those voices began to go silent, not because the truth changed, but because the pressure became too much to bear. In a perfect world, speaking the truth would be simple. Someone sees wrongdoing, they say something, and justice follows. But that's not how it works when power, reputation, and a million eyes are watching, especially not in a place like Daystar, where image meant everything. From the outside, it was a family ministry, a beacon of light, a Christian empire built on faith, hope, and family values. But behind the scenes, it was more complicated. There were secrets, and telling the truth came with consequences. When Jonathan and Susie Lamb came forward with their allegations, accusing Pete, a trusted insider, of inappropriate behavior toward their daughter, it sent a shockwave through the family, not just because of what they said, but because of what it meant. This wasn't an outsider stirring up drama. These were Joni Lamb's own son and daughter-in-law. They were part of the inner circle, and they were saying something no one wanted to hear. At first, others in the family quietly stood with them. Rebecca Lamb and her husband, JW, reportedly saw concerning behavior too. They expressed their support privately. JW even wrote a letter detailing what he had seen, something serious enough to shake anyone. For a moment, it seemed like the truth might actually come out, that there would be more than two voices carrying the weight of this storm. But then, silence. Not because the concerns disappeared, but because the pressure started creeping in. It didn't have to be loud. That's the thing about pressure in families like this. It's subtle, it's emotional, and it's wrapped in phrases like, think of the ministry, or don't destroy what your parents built. Suddenly, the people who once promised support stopped returning calls. They stopped speaking in meetings. They avoided public statements. And JW's letter, one of the clearest pieces of evidence from inside the family, never made it to the police. Why? Some say it was fear. Others say it was loyalty. But whatever the reason, the silence worked. With JW and Rebecca pulling back, Daystar leadership pushed forward with their narrative. Only Jonathan and Susie have a problem with Pete. It made it easier to call them bitter, easier to make them the problem. And when the rest of the family didn't speak up, that version of the story started to stick. But the truth doesn't disappear just because people stop talking. Inside, the division was real. There were hurt feelings, broken relationships, and people struggling with what they had seen versus what they were now pretending hadn't happened. It was like living in two different realities, one where you knew the truth, and another where you had to smile for the camera and act like everything was fine. That's the cost of silence. It protects the image, but it leaves wounds. For Jonathan and Susie, the cost was immediate. They lost their roles at the ministry, their influence, their community. People who once prayed with them turned their backs. They were accused of betrayal. They were told they were attacking the church, tearing down the family, but all they had done was speak the truth and refuse to back down when it got hard. Meanwhile, those who stayed quiet kept their positions. Their reputations remained intact. They didn't lose the spotlight. They didn't get the late-night hate mail or the cold stares at church. From the outside, it looked like they made the smart choice. But on the inside, that silence came with its own price. Guilt. Regret. The kind of quiet that keeps you up at night. Because they knew. They saw something. They felt something. And they didn't act. And that's what makes stories like this so painful. It's not just about the wrongdoing. It's about all the people who knew better and said nothing. The people who could have made a difference, but chose safety over truth. And in ministries built on moral leadership, that's a deeper betrayal than anything else. Supporters on the outside didn't know the full story. They only heard what Daystar told them, that the case was paused, that there was no evidence, that everything was fine. But behind those statements was a calculated decision to control the narrative, to keep things quiet, smooth, and under wraps. Silence became the strategy. Every time someone stayed quiet, it helped reinforce the version of the story Daystar wanted to sell, that there was no division, that the accusations were lies, that nothing bad had happened, and every time someone who knew better bit their tongue, the truth sank deeper out of reach. That's the high cost of truth, because telling the truth, it's not just about speaking. It's about being willing to lose something, maybe everything. And most people just aren't ready for that. It's easier to stay silent, easier to tell yourself it's not your fight, easier to protect your place in the system than to tear it all down for something that might not even be believed. But when no one speaks, the system wins. And the people who suffer most aren't the ones at the top. They're the ones caught in the middle. In this case, it was a child who needed adults to be brave, a child whose safety should have mattered more than anyone's reputation. Yet the silence won. The ministry stayed on air, the family kept smiling, and those who dared to break the illusion were left in the cold, carrying the burden alone. Years from now, people may look back and say, someone should have done something. But someone did. They just weren't believed, because the others who could have spoken up chose not to. And that's what made the truth so expensive. It wasn't just about what happened. It was about who stayed quiet and why, about what they chose to protect, and about the heavy weight that comes when the cost of truth is paid by only a few, while the silence of many keeps the lie alive.